Reading for Brother Jake's lesson will be taken from Galatians 6, 1 through 6. Galatians 6, 1 through 6. I'll be reading from the New King James Version. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone, not in another. For each one shall bear his own load. Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches.
Good to see everybody out this morning to worship God. Thanks, Cohen, for reading that set of verses this morning. Hopefully everybody had a good Thanksgiving holiday. It's a good holiday to reflect on and know that starting my new job recently, I've learned that a lot of people have it rough. And if you can't find anything to be thankful for, then find somebody that needs some help, and you'll find some things real quick that there's always things to be thankful for, and we need to constantly thank God for the blessings he's given us. Hopefully we had time to get together with family and spend quality time together and friends the past week. You came to hear a good lesson today, far and wide, you can talk to Ethan about getting a refund, because I'm not giving any guarantees, but I'm going to try my best. Today we're going to talk about Matthew chapter 23, and that's basically where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. Different versions say different things, but basically the sentence you've heard before is, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." And one thing that I learned from, among others, from Brother Jonathan Brown's gospel meeting that we saw recently, is that you can learn a lot just from dissecting one section of verses. I think oftentimes I try to jump around too much, and I try to pull in a lot of examples from different places, when you can just open up one set of verses like a story from Elijah and see a lot of things that we can apply to our lives. So you turn, well, just to go through the scripture reading that Cohen read. We're going the highlight of that applies to the lesson this morning is that if anyone thinks that they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. And Jesus took Matthew chapter 23 to go through and tear the Pharisees apart and the Sadducees. We're going to go through the chapter today if you've never read it. We're going to become familiar with it. And something to note about that is that there was a lot of bad things going on in the world in Jesus' time. The Romans were not perfect. The Persians were not perfect. The Egyptians were not perfect. And the Pharisees were not perfect. But Jesus didn't take the time to go through and point out the flaws of anybody but the Pharisees. And why do we think that is? Well, I would bet it's because the Pharisees were preaching one thing and practicing another, which, I mean, everybody can think in their mind of somebody they know that has done that, or maybe themselves who has done that. And in the 7 examples when Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees," he points out a specific thing. And what I'm going to try to do this morning is show some examples of where these 7 things might apply to our lives. You know, one of my favorite sets of verses in the entire Bible is, can't remember where it is, but it's the set of verses where Nathan talks to David about his sins that he committed with Bathsheba, the murder, the adultery, and how he convinces David of the wrong that he committed. Was he tells him a story of something that exactly paralleled what he did. And David was like, "That's terrible. How can anybody have done that?" Nathan convinced David to agree to the same things that he did, but in another story. That's the best way to convince somebody of anything, is to have them agree to it without knowing what they're doing. And I think Jesus is doing that with us. It's easy for us to sit up and say, "Man, them Pharisees are terrible. Okay, Pharisees are bad. Check. I'll stay away from them." How many Pharisees do we have walking outside? Real Pharisees, not figurative Pharisees like we're talking about today. No. But the same trap and the same mistakes that the Pharisees fell into, how many years ago? 2,000 years ago, apply to us today. So, first off, you might say, what is a Pharisee? Nothing but a blood-sucking lawyer. That's what they were. They interpreted the law, just like some of us do today. The Pharisees emerged as a distinct group shortly after the Maccabean revolt, so just telling that in the 100, 200 BC. The Romans conquered the Jews, and the Jews revolted for hundreds of years. And then the Romans really cracked down on the Jews, and that's the time that Jesus lived in. It is generally believed spiritual descendants of the Hasidians. The Pharisees emerged as a party of laymen and scribes in contradiction to the Sadducees, the party of the high priesthood that had traditionally provided the sole leadership of the Jewish people. The basic difference that led to the split between the Pharisees and the Sadducees lay in their respective attitudes toward the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. The problem of finding it answers the questions and basis for decisions about contemporary legal and religious matters arising under circumstances far different from those of the time of Moses. In their response to this problem, the Sadducees, on the one hand, refused to accept any precept as binding unless it was based directly on the Torah, the written law. The Pharisees, on the other hand, believed that the law of God gave to Moses was twofold, consisting of the written law and the oral law, the teachings of the prophets and the oral traditions of the Jewish people, whereas the priestly Sadducees taught the written Torah was the only source of revelation. The Pharisees admitted the principle of evolution in the law. Humans must use their reason in interpreting the Torah and applying it to contemporary problems. The Pharisees were a group of religious people. They were Jews who were part of the religious, authority. They were in the times of Jesus. They, unlike the Sadducees, as pointed out, were common people. They didn't have the education. They weren't part of the temple. They weren't part of the Levites like the Sadducees were. So they weren't as respected, I guess I should say. They were more of the, I guess you'd probably call them religious fanatics today, because they devoted their entire life to tearing apart the law of Moses and applying it to every aspect of life, to their detriment. But as we can see throughout the New Testament, the Pharisees were a thorn in Jesus' side. They were always trying to trick him. They were always trying to get him to say things that he would not usually agree to, put him in scenarios, trying to trip him up. And in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus sets this up. Matthew chapter 25, it's the only chapter we're saying today. Matthew 25, we'll go through that. Verses 1 through 12. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. You must be careful to do everything they tell you, but not to do what they do. For they do not practice what they preach. They tie up every cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace, to be called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So 2 things to take away from that introduction to Jesus' lashing of the Pharisees. The Pharisees, first thing, he did not say, don't listen to the Pharisees. They're a bunch of hypocrites. They're going to lie to you. They're not going to tell you the truth. He said, do what they say, because that's not wrong. But don't follow their example, because they're up here all for themselves. They like to make a good show. They like to, what's it say? They love the place of honor. Everything is done for people to see. We're going to go through and see the 7 things that they do relating to that. The second thing is just an aside, I guess, following a conversation that I've had recently. If you've ever wondered why in our church here we don't have minister, side minister, front minister, back minister, we don't really have an authority beyond what the church, beyond the elders and deacons that God lays out in the Bible. Because verse 10, nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. We are following God's example here. And as it says, the greatest among you will be your servant. So if you've ever wondered that, why we don't have an established line of ministers here, it's because we have one minister who is God, and we just do our best to spread that message as we can. So the first woe that Jesus, speaking to the Pharisees, says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. So basically he's saying, heed my warning, Pharisees. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. So Jesus is telling them, you guys are bringing people down because you have this high image of yourself built up, and you like everybody to place you on the pedestal. How can that apply to us? You might have heard somebody say, I don't go to that place. They're a bunch of hypocrites. I don't listen to them. And you know, the world, Christians invite criticism from the world when they try to live godly lives. Because if I can cut you down by saying you don't do what you practice, that means I don't have to do it either. Because why should I do it if they're doing it? Well, just like the Pharisees, they fell victim to that trap, just as Jesus is pointing out. We can't take anything to heaven, but we can try to bring other people with us. We can also most certainly bring people down if we invite that criticism in our lives by saying, that guy's up there preaching all day long, that group, they're criticizing everybody, and they do the same things I see them preaching against. So just like the Pharisees, this is one of the more simpler and basic, but still the message is just as strong as before. That doesn't mean we shouldn't preach. Then you might sit back and say, okay, I'll solve that real quick. I won't preach. I'll just sit there the rest of my life and let somebody else preach for me. Doesn't work like that. We have to preach the truth. We have to live the truth. And we have to be careful not to discourage. And we may let people down once in a while. That's part of life. We are imperfect human beings. But we have to make it our duty and our job in life to correct when that happens and to try to preach and live the truth as much as we can. And he kind of also follows this in the next set, and it's a similar message, but I'm going to take a new point out of it. So in the second, woe to you, teachers of the law, verse 15, and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much of a child as hell as you are. So in the same sense, he's saying, you guys are trying so hard, you're going so far and spending so much energy to convert one person just to bring them down because they're following your false ways. That follows the same message that I just said previously. When we live a bad example, or when we teach things that are false, we bring anybody down with us that we are trying to convince. So let that be known to yourself. Well, if I do something bad, that's all right. Well, it doesn't look as good when you're taking other people down with you. But the second point I'm going to take out of that is that when we ourselves try to convert other Christians, which we're supposed to do, and that's a noble deed. Sometimes I feel like it's easy to say, all right, you're a Christian now, you've obeyed the gospel, you're living your life, you've committed your life to Jesus. You're ready to go. Have fun. I'll see you in heaven. We let them go, and that's it. And they're like out in the water without a life vest, a life preserver, and we do not aid them along the way, like we might have received or like we're supposed to. So we need to be careful that if we're out in the world preaching the gospel, converting others, We have people in the church that are interested in that. We don't leave them standing and say, decide to take that on. Or overburden them. Be like, all right, now you got to do this, 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 this. Here's a checklist. Here's what you got to do, and then you're good. It's a slow process. There's the milk and the meat. We go into those verses. But that is just like I said, that's not the focus Jesus was telling the Pharisees here. But that's an application we can bring to our own lives. Verse 16. This is a big one for me and for everyone, and I think this is one that's most applicable to us. And another comment I'll make about this is that when reading this for the first time, you kind of read these and they don't really make sense. You're like, all right, Pharisees are bad, good, we'll just move on. And when you really tear them apart, it kind of helps you understand what Jesus is talking about. And for me, it really did resonate and how I can improve. And this is one myself. Verse 16, what are you blind guys? He changed it, doesn't say scribes and Pharisees, it says blind guys. Imagine you're walking around a foreign country and the guy leading you around is blind. How good would that go? You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And everyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. So Jesus is telling them, half the things you guys are teaching doesn't even make sense. How can I say, well, you swear by the temple, you're good, but you swear by the gold, now you're stuck, you're bound. That doesn't even make sense. The gold is in the temple that you're swearing on. And that's not the point. We're not talking about swearing on the gold of the temple. Jesus is saying, you guys are enforcing things on people that doesn't even make sense. You don't even understand it yourselves. So here's the lesson. Here's the example I thought about myself. So during COVID, as everybody knows, people were doing all kinds of things that didn't make sense. One of them that came to mind, when you travel on airplanes, you had to wear a mask. But if you're eating, you didn't have to wear a mask. So when you're on an 8-hour flight and you're eating every 30 minutes, you're taking your mask off every 30 minutes for most of that time. So you're putting your mask on for about an hour. I guess COVID doesn't travel when you're eating. That must be the rules. So, well, how can we apply that to our lives? If we can't explain it to someone else, and even if this is an aspect of our religion, Christianity, if I can't explain it to you, then why do you believe it? You need to be able to understand every aspect. Because then somebody says, okay, we got the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, the three Holy. Well, that's just something we talk about, and we'll understand it some other time. We need to take the time to break down. And if you don't understand something, that's fine. But you need to clear that up. You need to talk. And we can't go around preaching things that doesn't make sense or that we don't understand, because we'll be just like the Pharisees. Well, you got to swear by the temple or by the gold in it, and it just works out in the end. You just got to trust me. Is that going to make sense? If somebody told you that, would you be like, that's the religion I'm signing up for? That's what you got to ask yourself. That's what Jesus is teaching the Pharisees. And in the same sense, in verse 23, Jesus telling them, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. I think some versions say you tithe a tenth of your spices, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the law without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. So for anybody that doesn't understand this, the Jews had to give 10% of everything they made, money-wise, crop-wise. These guys, just like mom's got her spice rack out back, were tithing every inch of every penny they ever made. You'd be like, you go pick up a dollar bill on the sidewalk, they're taking 10% of it out and giving it to the tax collectors. That's fine. Jesus is saying, don't not do that. But these guys are doing that, and they're leaving out the biggest aspects of the law: justice, mercy, faithfulness. I feel like we can fall victim to the same trap. We can get caught up on the small details, arguing day after day about things in the church and then I'll tell you right now, there is work to do in the world. There are people who are struggling. There are people who are lost. We need to make sure that we have our priorities right, and we are focusing on the bigger things, on justice, on mercy, and our unfaithfulness, instead of straining the gnats. And that's the other thing, is that they couldn't eat anything that's unclean. Gnats and camels are unclean. So they've got their drinks and they're straining them out because they don't want to swallow a gnat. But they got a camel sitting in his drink over here. He's like, why are you worried about the gnat when you got a camel sitting in your drink? In the same sense, we may be sitting here arguing over one little thing or something or another, and there's so many bigger things out in the world that we could be doing to advance the cause of Christ. Verse 25. The last two or three things are kind of all in the same message, and they're more of a personal sense. Verse 25. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of greed, self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will also be clean. They were so concerned, Jesus is saying, you want everybody to make sure you're all clean cut, got your suit and tie on, your tie straight, got your cufflinks, that the inside of your cup's still full of dirt. You're consumed with greed and the self-indulgence. This passage I had from an article I was reading below says, their emphasis on legalism, appearances, and worldly honor is like washing the outside of their cups and plates instead of the inside. You ever ask yourself that? What are they going to think if they see me like that? What will the world think what will they say about West Main if we do this? Or are we more worried about the inside of the cup? What's the inside of us look like? And the same in verse 27. What do you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites? You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones, of dead and everything unclean. The same way on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness. We all have skeletons in our closet, everybody. That's just the fact of life. But the point is what are you trying to cover up? You're trying to whitewash your closet? You're trying to make everybody, oh, he's perfect. You don't need to mess with him. He's got everything right. And then somebody mentioned this last week in a lesson. When we do that, when we all try to wear our whitewashed suits and ties, just imagine somebody here's wearing a suit and tie, that creates a false image for other Christians who might not have as white a suit. And they think, I need to create a false image for myself so that they're not judging me. And then everybody in here's got their white suit on, when on the inside we're all dirty the way it is. So the point to take out of that is don't create false images of yourself to try to please other people in the church, because in the end, what they think does not matter one bit. We're all answering to God in the end, not each other. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, that we're examining today, comes from verse 29. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what the ancestors started. I feel like this is another one that does not so much apply to me because I've only been alive for 20-some years. But if you might have been alive for a few more years than that, the Pharisees are sitting here saying, we just heard about Elijah was one of the only religious men in his day in the whole land. And he had to live in a canyon for however long because he was being persecuted. And these guys said, if I was alive back then, I'd have been sitting in that canyon with Elijah because that's just what I'd have done. I know I could do it. How would they? Jesus is saying, who would you say that? How would you know that? You weren't there. I feel like we can say the same thing. The world is so bad today And it's so hard. Everybody hates God, and it's not like it used to be. If it were 20, 30, 80, 100, 200 years ago, I would have a better, it would be easier to be a Christian. We could convert everybody, and people just don't follow God like they used to. Well, guess what? The Pharisees said the same thing, and Jesus called them out the same way. We can't be lost in the past. Every generation has their battles to deal with. We can't let that be our excuse for spreading the gospel and doing the commission that Jesus set out for us to do. So there's my rant for this morning. That was our breakdown of Jesus' 7 warnings to the scribes and Pharisees, some takeaways to, think about, to apply to yourself. Practice what we preach, but still preach. Don't take the easy out by saying, well, I'm not going to say anything because I'm afraid of saying something wrong or afraid of saying something that I might contradict. We still have to preach, even if there's a risk we might say contradict that. We just need to correct that if it happens. Don't bring others down with us with either false teachings or misguided teachings. Make sure we understand it. Be rational with our thoughts. Make sure everything you say has a reason, not just because, well, that's the way we've always done it. That's the way I like to do it. Make sure it's rational and be clean inside and out. It's not, we cannot wear our whitewash suits and say, try to make everybody think everything's good when it's not, because that doesn't help anybody. So thanks for listening, everybody, this morning. If anybody has a need from the congregation, would like prayers, would like prayers from the congregation, you can have a seat up front. Or if anybody would still like to obey the gospel this time and be baptized, you can have a seat up front as we stand and sing.